So welcome to, I think I'm right about this. This is our final lecture for the season, and appropriate, wonderful person to deliver this final lecture. Charles Lewis is one of America's great investigative journalists, not just for his own work, which on its own would qualify him for that title, but I think just as important for the institutions that he has found and helped build, which are critical in sustaining and, one might hope, restoring the essential role of investigative journalism in America. Lewis began his career in television news, first with ABC and then with Mike Wallace at CBS's 60 Minutes. He left 60 Minutes in 1988. Wikipedia says it was, quote, frustration that the most important issues of the day were not being reported. Those were the old days, of course, that's all changed now. And in 1989, he founded the Center for Public Integrity, the nation's oldest and largest nonpartisan, nonprofit investigative news organization. Seems a little bit redundant, nonprofit investigative news organization, but there we go. CPI has won endless awards while directing it. Lewis helped produce 14 books and hundreds of investigative reports. Indeed, when I think of the rise of the pathologically corrupt period of money in American politics, Lewis and the CPI were the most prolific and insightful sources in America, tracking and exposing this culture of corruption when it was just being born. In 1996, for example, CPI gave us the Lincoln bedroom scoop, suggestion that Bill Clinton was selling access to the White House in exchange for campaign contributions. That was the buying of the president in 1996. Then there was the buying of the president of Congress 1998, and then we got two more buyings of the presidents in 2000 and 2004. Money isn't the only thing CPI focuses on. It has produced extraordinarily important work about the Iraq War and the conflicts, including corruption-like conflicts within that war, generally as it describes itself, where there are, quote, abuses of power, corruption and betrayal of trust by public and private institutions. CPI is there using the tools of investigative journalism. Under his leadership in 1997, CPI spawned the International Consortium of Investigative Journalists, the world's first working network of reporters in more than 50 countries around the globe, producing content on international exposés. And as a result, he has spent endless hours on planes and hotel rooms, this is familiar, across the world, spreading this ethic of journalism at its best. Now, it would have been enough for any career to have launched CPI and then sit back and watch it flourish, but that's not been Lewis's choice. In 2005, he left to become the founding president for the Fund of Independence Journalism, an endowment and legal defense fund for CPI. And then in 2008, he became the founding executive editor of the Investigative Reporting Workshop, which is a research center at American University School of Communication. And in that capacity, from 2009 through the end of last year, he has published more than 40 multimedia investigative journalist stories, which have won half a dozen national awards, and is the largest university-based investigative reporting center in the US, and unfortunately the only one in Washington. And still there is more. Since 2006, he has been Professor Charles Lewis. He's a professor of journalism at the American University. In this part of the world, meaning at the Safra Center, focused as we are on institutional corruption, there could be no greater God. Charles Lewis is the standard for integrity and energy in doing the very best that journalism and scholarship can do, and I'm incredibly happy and honored to welcome him back to Harvard for this, the final lecture of our academic year. So please join me in welcoming Charles Lewis.
Thanks so much, Larry, and it's a real treat to be here. Thank you all for coming. I'll try to make this as painless as possible, but I don't dance or anything. Anyway, I didn't really become obsessed with corruption, but I started noticing patterns, and that's really what I wanted to talk about tonight. Basically, I've sort of flirted with all these strange things or sites. I came to Washington as an intern in 1974. It happened to be an interesting year, Watergate, of course. And I had an internship with a Republican senator. Most of them wanted to hide under their desk. They didn't want to seem too loyal to Nixon or too critical for various reasons. And it was a welcome to Washington moment, to put it mildly. And then 5 years later, I was working for Carl Bernstein at ABC News in Washington, and then went on to the stuff you heard. But I noticed in the late 80s that, in my view, and I asked a lot of people that I was fascinated with, like Kevin Phillips, who had done a lot of writing, and others, and I kept saying to people, something's really strange in this city. The journalists are not covering some of these issues it seems like they ought to cover. Most journalists missed the Iran-Contra scandal, as you're probably aware. It first broke in the Middle East. Hate when that happens. In fact, most reporters learned about Iran-Contra from the Attorney General announcing it, which is a really bad sign, since they were the administration in question involved directly. The SNL scandal, most reporting that was well done was outside Washington. And the defense procurement scandal was mostly done by prosecutors. 130 people went to prison, but where were the journalists? And I could go on and give you many, many examples, but I kept seeing cases where these systemic issues were not being addressed, remotely even. And meanwhile, I was getting a little frustrated inside the media world, which that's a whole nother story, and I'll save it maybe for later if you want, but that's not why I'm here to. I did walk out of there. I don't recommend it necessarily, that you quit a job and have no idea what you're going to do next, but that's what I did, and I started the Center for Public Integrity from my house. All the good investigative reporting names were taken. The Fund for Investigative Journalism, investigative reporters and editors is, anyway, Center for Investigative, all these names. So I'm like, well, I can't use that name. And so I noticed that everything I'd ever looked into or cared about had to do with integrity. So I thought, why not? It did sound a little strange, I admit, but that's what we did. So anyway, I'll spare you. This is not about the history of the center exactly, but I do want to get into some of the examples of the kinds of things we looked at, and all of them, the term I was asked to give a title for tonight was legal corruption and the mercenary culture, because I noticed that most of the problems seem to be legal. And I know we're here in the law school. Don't get me started. But anyway, there is something really interesting about that, and I'm trying not to think too much about that because it's not exactly my field, but I did notice that a lot of folks were doing a lot of things, making fairly obscene amounts of money, bending policies that were sort of antithetical to the public. Oh yeah, the public. And anyway, and it was almost never acknowledged by the media, which is another problem. So we started looking at various issues. The very first report was, my last story at 60 Minutes was about U.S. trade officials going to work for the people they were negotiating against. Friday working for the U.S., Monday working for China or Japan or whomever. And I was fascinated, like, wow, that's interesting. There's no rules about that. I mean, could you wait at least maybe a week in some cases? And so we started noticing. So the first report we worked on for 10 or 12 months, and it was called America's Frontline Trade Officials, and we tracked, and tracked sounds a little creepy, I realize, but we investigated, whatever. We studied, gathered information about 75 men and women who were in the U.S. Trade Representative's office, which is a cabinet-level office in the White House. And we noticed that 47% of them, when they left government, went to work for foreign governments or foreign corporations, which was really an interesting thing because at that time we had a very, very high trade deficit. I think not nearly as high as we have with China today, but then it was Japan. And to some people that meant we were hemorrhaging hundreds of thousands of jobs, and it was kind of a sensitive issue, but of course most of the media wasn't covering that. They were covering the latest trade statistics and latest comments by this Treasury Secretary, but no one was going into the weeds like this. We found that 12 people had classified clearances who were actually registered foreign agents for other countries at that time, including Iraq, which had just killed 37 Americans on the USS Stark. So there was really a lot of weird things here. And after it was done, the Justice Department found that. They keep changing their name, but the Government Accountability Office did an investigation. There were congressional hearings. 4 presidential candidates cited this, what I just said, and Bill Clinton in his first days in office did an executive order putting a lifetime ban on trade officials. So that was interesting because there had been, that's not so much a gray area. It turns out there was no law about it and there was no one paying attention, period, even remotely. And then another one was entirely legal. We did a report called Saving for a Rainy Day. In the middle of the night, the House of Representatives voted in its wisdom, not really wisdom, to give themselves all their campaign money, let them put it in their pocket and walk out the door. It's a nice deal if you can get it. And so 112 former members of Congress converted $10 million to their personal use. Some of them tried to be subtle, like having a museum in their own name and you know, other kinds of ridiculous things. But anyway, finally there was an uproar after several years, and the only way we knew about it is they did have a requirement to report how they spent the money. And besides laughing at some of the ridiculous things they were spending it on, it was also, of course, outrageous. And it was eventually outlawed, not necessarily because of what we did. We did do 2 reports about that over 91 and 94. We then started looking at presidential campaigns. We noticed that the press has a fawning nature, you may have noticed, at least in beginnings of the campaign, they all swoon over everyone until they get in and then look out. But we noticed that there was no coverage of who was close to the candidates. There's a mating dance that goes on in Washington. The person who's going to be the next president of the United States suddenly has a lot of friends. And there's suddenly 100 or 200 unpaid policy advisors who just kind of cozy up and appear around. And of course, they're all working for very, very powerful interests, and they're all getting extra money now because they've got a connection to possibly the next president of the United States. So we started to decide that, look, who are these people and what do they do in their day jobs? And our most interesting finding was the deputy chairman of the George Herbert Walker Bush re-election campaign was working for BCCI, the Bank of Commerce and Credit International that defrauded 50,000 people and was prosecuted all over the world. At that point, there were just 7 federal criminal grand jury investigations. So they had not been convicted yet. And James Lake was traveling back and forth to Abu Dhabi and making $1 million a year. And this was in Justice Department records. Once again, no one read the records. When I went to one of the 2 most respected newspapers in the United States, I'm trying to be somewhat charitable here, that narrows it down a bit. One of the most famous reporters said, well, that's not a story, that's legal. And I said, I think it's a story. And we had a news conference, we had 60 reporters, and it did make news. And the White House wasn't happy, of course, which was terribly upsetting, So anyway, that's the kind of things we were starting to get into. We did a report looking at classified documents. When U.S. officials leave, if they're really particularly high profile, they want to get a big advance, sometimes in the millions of dollars. And there seems to be a tendency to get thousands of records that put them in a particularly favorable light and take them with them to their homes. And they literally back trucks up to their offices and take this stuff. And they then put processes in to get that stuff declassified, but they time it for when their book comes out, of course. And then the rest of those documents, which are tens of thousands of documents or hundreds of thousands, depending on the official, they might come out in 30 or 40 years. So we've gotten a little selective glimpse of what they'd like you to know about their favorite moments, but not the rest of the story, which we still don't have all the Iran-Contra documents. The last two presidents, Bush and others, are keeping this from the public still. Don't get me started. So this is a problem. And the other problem was, of course, them getting, and it's nothing we can do about it, but basically getting rather wealthy from that element of, yes, having all these records and then quoting stuff. It's not only that they're putting forward their image to the world, they're also, that increases their lecture fees. The history books will say nice things because the only thing they can read are these documents. So anyway, that bothered me. We then were fascinated by political party chairmen. I noticed, if you look at the Articles of Confederation, and not that I know that you basically all read that once a week, the Constitution, there's no mention, not a word about political parties. They basically don't exist, according to the Founding Fathers, at least in those rather important documents. It turns out that probably the two most important organizations in Washington, at least two of them, are the two parties, of course. They're private corporations, even though they help us. Our whole leadership process depends on the parties. The fact of the matter is there's an awful lot of shenanigans going on with those parties. So what we did was we looked at private parties. We wanted to see what the political party chairmen were up to. When, you know, they all have these charters that say it's a full-time job. Well, we found that in 20 years, half of them were lobbyists and they were party chairmen. So if you wanted to find out the vote count in the House of Representatives, you go to the party chairman. If you're the tobacco industry and you're talking to the particular party close to them, you arrange legislation and wire it basically in both houses through the party. And did I mention the party, of course, gets a lot of money to the party. And that's how it all works. Is this covered like that by the media? Of course not. Do most Americans know what I just said? I don't really think so. So we interviewed the chairman. The conflict of interest thing, it's not an illegal thing because it's a private organization to begin with. It's a private corporation. When we came out with this report, the person who we had spent a lot of time investigating, because he was in the news at that moment, was the current chairman at the time, Ron Brown, who, as you may recall, later becomes the Commerce Secretary. And he had gone to work for Baby Doc Duvalier in Haiti, putting a happy face on affairs there. They weren't going so well there, if you recall. There's a lot of human rights abuses. He was a lobbyist for the city of Denver when they were deciding where the convention should be for the Democratic Party. He had a corner office at Patton Boggs and Blow, which was, you know, the biggest Democratic lobby law firm in Washington. So he knew the vote counts, and so he's wearing all these hats. It's not illegal, once again, and I could give you other things that seem to be a conflict. I don't know if Sam Lowenberg is here, but actually Sam worked on that for 6 months. So he's up here occasionally. Anyway, that came out, and the FBI questioned Ron Brown for 5 hours. Woodward did a story in the Post that said that. I didn't know it. I read it like everybody else. But it caused a bit of an uproar. But that still continues today. Does anyone look at the party? That was like many years ago that we did that. Like we're talking almost 20 years. Has it changed? No, the short answer. We looked at the, just for the sheer sport of it, private parties. We looked at, the torturers lobby, we called it, and we looked at, we identified what appeared to be the 25 worst countries on earth for torturing their citizens. I should note that no human rights group actually does that. They don't want to marginalize or excuse the other 170 countries in the world who also may have dubious records, so no one wants to rank those. So we had to sort of make an assessment from multiple organizations, plus State Department and UN and other information to come up with that. And we found that we wanted to find out which were the firms that were helping them get aid. And we did. And the firm that had the most human rights abusing countries, 7 by our count, was Hill and Knowlton. Anyway, that was that, again, once again, legal. And what we noticed the process was, countries, African countries, doesn't matter what part of the world, they would come in, they'd want to get U.S. aid. It could be 8 million, 10 million, it could be 50 million, it could be 300 million. And the lobby firm would get a cut of it, usually at least $1 million, depending on the country and the situation and the firm. Once again, everything I just said is entirely legal. Did it mean that they would put a happy face on things like torture and a lot of different countries' cases? The answer to that is yes. And you could see the letters, which I have to say were quite extraordinary. These are public records. No one was reading them, but they're pretty interesting. We looked at the Environmental Protection Agency, and we wanted to look at the Superfund program. Yes, this is the Revolving Door, and we noticed that essentially 80% of the Superfund program officials went to work for private companies who were contractors now to EPA, and all of them were making 3, 4, 5 times their prior salary. That's not illegal, it's the world, but we thought it was interesting. And some of the officials were really famous people, like EPA administrators, and one of them went ballistic. It was interesting. I could tell you so many stories. I'll stop. But I'm just trying to give you a flavor of these types of things. We lived sleeping with the industry. We looked at the U.S. Forest Service, and I had this image of Smokey the Bear, and what a nice idea, those big, beautiful trees. And well, it turns out they're basically shilling for the timber interests. They do almost everything the timber companies want. I had no idea, and we got inside of that agency that they had been captured like so many agencies and departments. We did, one of our biggest reports in the first 3 or 4 years was called Wellheeled. And we looked at inside lobbying for healthcare reform, looking at the Clinton healthcare reform. We had 17 researchers, writers, editors, looking at 660 companies and associations, whatever, from all sides, AFL-CIO to the insurance companies. We actually had a reporter in Connecticut on the ground tracking the insurance industry directly. And we found, as you would expect, all kinds of things, once again, entirely legal. 80 former U.S. officials in just 2 years left, and again, tripled, quadrupled, quintupled their salaries, knowing that this would be a big moment historically. There were 181 privately funded trips in just a 2-year period, and 1/3 of them were paid for by the American Medical Association in places like the Bahamas in February. It's a great place for an education and a conference, I guess. 5 committees looking at it, all doing markups and everything, and many of those members of Congress were trading stock during the markup sessions directly, which we only flirted with. We pointed it out because they all had holdings. We didn't go deep with that at that time. We then looked at Contract with an American, was the name of the report, and we noticed that the Speaker of the House's wife, we don't like to pick on spouses or husbands, whatever, but we noticed that Speaker Newt Gingrich's wife, who had previously sold Tupperware from her home, had been made a vice president of the Israel Export Development Corporation in Israel. And it seemed, I don't know, it seemed unusual to me. And we noticed that the thing had been set up by a member of Congress, a close friend of Gingrich's, the former Congressman Vin Weber. He threatened us with litigation if we published it, and I said, please sue us because you have violated federal law according to my reading and talking to ethical lawyers, and he never sued. That was, once again, welcome to Washington. This happens all the time, but it was kind of right in front of us. We were one of the first to look at, not to pick on Ron Brown, but he was starting to do trips around the world with trade missions. And so you had the Clinton White House and the political party, the Democratic Party, getting donations, soliciting hard for donations from industry, and then they would take a plane trip chartered with the secretary on the plane and other officials from the White House, and they would go to places like Russia and China and other places, and there are many more than 28 companies that would like to go on a trip like that, of course. Gosh, who do you think actually got on the plane? Use your imagination there. It was not by lottery, let's put it that way. And so that was kind of interesting. When Steve Forbes ran for president in '96, we noticed that he was very big on the flat tax. And being playful, we said, hey, that's really interesting. Has anyone ever figured out what he would pay in taxes if we had a flat tax? And we said, hey, that's a great idea. So we got Federal Election Commission records, because whenever you run for president, if any of you decide to do that, you have to file a financial disclosure form. And so we took his finances, we went to a CPA, and who estimated that he would cut his taxes in half. And our favorite moment was, you get your jollies in small ways here. Meet the Press with Tim Russert before he died. Russert has Forbes on, and he says, the Center for Public Integrity has found that this flat tax you're talking about would cut all your tax obligation in half. Is that true? And Steve didn't blink, of course, and I forget what he said, but it was not memorable, and he didn't really answer. But anyway, that was interesting. Nothing happened. Of course, it's not illegal, what I just said. None of this is illegal. In '96, we did the first of the buying of the President books, and the reason I mention it is there had been four making of the President books by Theodore White. There had been the selling of the President by Joe McGinnis in '68, which is really more about advertising. None of those books really talked about where did those people get all that money to run? And it always struck me as peculiar, like, oh, you just happen to have tens of millions of dollars out there, just going to go out on the stump, are you? And so it always bothered me that no one looked at it. So we did this epic project with scores of people, actually 100 interns at 2 universities, plus a dozen, 2 dozen, whatever, I forget how many, it was more than a dozen. And we noticed a number of things. We were fascinated by the net worth of members of Congress, or who were then decided to run for president. We noticed, and this was not unique to us, I think others reported this, I should say. I mean, I'm not sure how much we contributed to this, but we were struck by it. Bob Dole, who had been in public life for 44 years at that point, was the Senate Majority Leader, and he had pushed through the ethanol subsidy, being, from Kansas. That fits in with agribusiness, of course, and brought billions of dollars to Archer Daniels Midland. The CEO of that company was Dwayne Andreas. So Dwayne sold Liddy Dole, Elizabeth Dole, and the brother, so not Bob, I should be very clear. Of course, Bob stayed there all the time. A condo overlooking the Atlantic Ocean. The first mortgage payment was not for 7 months, and it was $100,000 under the market price. This was, the Senate Ethics Committee did not see anything particularly untoward about what I just said. Phil Graham, who said, my best friend is ready money, if you recall, infamously in '96, his top donor was the National Rifle Association, and he had helped introduce or sponsor 18 bills on their behalf. And for his whole life to have them as his #1 donor was quite unusual, I have to say, for anybody. Usually it was a company or some other interest. But anyway, he had a second floor put on his house, and it costing tens of thousands of dollars. I don't exactly know how much, but some people thought that might seem unethical and might be an issue for the Senate Ethics Committee. The committee didn't see anything unusual about this. This was a contributor, of course. We looked at career patrons. Top 10 career patrons went through all the contributions they got in their life. Now, with Bob, we made an exception. 44 years is a long time. We just did 30 years with Bob. But the rest of them, we did pretty much their whole careers. And we then identified their best friends, so to speak, the ones who had sponsored and enabled their careers, and what it appeared they had done for their sponsors, basically. So when the book came out, the top 10 career patrons moved on the wires. AP, New York Times, Washington Post moved them all over the place. The New York Times serialized the book. Frontline did a So You Want to Buy a President based on the book. But no one had ever looked at the best friends and the career patrons. So it was sort of, from a reporting standpoint, and this all came out before the election started, I should mention, before Iowa, before New Hampshire. No one had ever, there had not been a book on this subject in general like this, and there had never been one before the election. We thought the voter had a right to know this, sort of a voter guide almost, not the kind that you usually read. We looked at the thing that fascinated me from that was an epiphany for me, and I was starting to become slightly jaded, I admit, at that point. I noticed that the presidential candidate who raised the most money the year before the election from 1975 to 2000, this is even though it's still a few years after that book, the candidate raising the most money the year before the actual primaries was getting the nomination of the party every single time. And that's really interesting. It's known as the wealth primary or the money primary, that 90% of the money, the checks written, actually are, at least in that period of time, were written the year before the actual primaries and caucuses start. So the point is the public helps to decide who actually will be the leader, or at least the choices for the leader. The reason that's notable is in 2000, when George W. Bush decided to run, 5 Republican presidential candidates dropped out after the Iowa straw poll in August of '99 because the financial reports came in for George W., and the numbers were staggering. He had been quietly gathering money and having entertaining guests in his mansion. Yes, we reported on that too. And no one knew it. They kept being coy. He's not sure he's going to run. Meanwhile, they're building a war chest, and it all pops into the FEC records, and all of a sudden they're all noticing that he may have already gotten the nomination. They haven't even voted yet. The first vote officially is in Iowa like 5 months later, 4 months later, but 2 former cabinet officials dropped out, actually including Elizabeth Dole and others. And so that was really revealing because it meant that money was dictating our choices even before there was a single vote, which to me was, I have to say, fairly, actually almost alarming. We noticed that, to our utter surprise, Bob Dole's biggest single donor in his life, 44 years, well, 30 years, we only checked 30, was the Gallo wine family. And that's kind of, well, it's kind of interesting because he's from Kansas and there aren't that many grapes in Kansas, is all I can tell you. Gallo is not in Kansas. Like, Bob, what's going on here? And there had been an amendment called the Gallo Amendment where Ernest and Julio, sorry, that's the Gallo guys, they wanted to have a special tax to avoid, well, an exception, I guess you'd say, to the inheritance tax, and they didn't want to pay it, essentially. It was known as the Gallo Amendment. Bob went to work for them. I think he was the majority leader, and he got them this special exception. And then what happens is Bob helps them out. They had this is kind of strange, but it really happened. Gallo, no offense to Gallo, I'm sure it's a terrific wine. I'm not sure. It happens to be also very inexpensive. And essentially, they noticed because if you make a certain quantity of wine, you have to put on there was a alcohol, tobacco, and firearm regulation that if you're making a vat as big as this room of cheap wine, you have to say on the label bulk processing. And they hated that word bulk. It kind of bothered them. So they wanted to change that, say it's not required, and also put a new thing on their label saying Charmant method. It sounds sort of French. Sounds better than bulk. And there's letters from Bob directly to the top of the agency saying how important this is for America that they change this label. I swear to God. This came from a Freedom of Information request. But again, all of this is entirely legal. Now, most Americans don't meet their member of Congress or presidential candidate, and most people don't give money. 96% of the American people don't give a penny. I don't know what the numbers are today. Back a few years ago, it was 96. It's maybe around that now. I don't exactly know, but it's not a lot. So anyway, there's others and things in that book, but the book was fairly, as they would say for an investigative journalist, a target-rich environment, looking at the presidential candidates. We looked at the buying, of course, being compulsive, we did the buying of the Congress. We got to do Congress. And so we had 36 researchers, writers, editors, and we looked at the Congress, which, you know, was eye-opening. For example, there had been an E. coli outbreak. Children had died eating bad burgers at different fast food places, and so there was a thought that a lot of people thought we should have tighter standards. The USDA was still doing the poke and sniff that they had done 50 years earlier. There was nothing scientific about checking for E. coli, which of course you can't see. And so a lot of people thought you should toughen up those regulations. We looked at the Agriculture Committee in the U.S. Senate and the House, and both of them for 10 years got astonishing sums of money, millions and millions and millions of dollars from the meat packers and other companies and industries around meat and meat packing. And funny, that legislation to change the inspection process requiring the USDA to do it just never made it out of committee. And of course, anyone who studies Congress, the chairs of each committee are the ones who get most of the cash because, of course, they control the calendar for what gets done. And sure enough, that happened. We found that for every possible thing you can imagine, the price of milk, you take whatever issue that affects your life, we went through, and not every, but a lot of them, and we looked through, and we noticed that the common sense thing that most Americans might appreciate were not the things that the industry wanted, and usually the industry won. It was the general theme there, without going too much deeper there. But the Congress book was really kind of eye-opening, and I could go deep on any of these, but I'm trying not to do that, although you may say, well, enough already. Anyway, so we then were fascinated by, I don't exactly know how we got on this, but we decided to look at tax cheats and the whole issue of who pays their taxes and exactly what does the IRS do about it and what's the story there. We had a suspicion that if you have a lot of money, you could possibly avoid that. Call me crazy. And so I put several people on this, and we looked U.S. tax court records. We had a dozen people looking for 3 years. And we had identified 36 cases that were, to us, quite stunning. And we took the best 12 of the 36, the ones that were just astonishing to us. And we, these are nonprofits that were, enriching themselves. This is the Bishop Estate folks out in Hawaii. We found a guy who stole tens of millions of dollars and just told his mother he'd never see her again, but have a good life, and fled and was wanted by Interpol. And I found him in the jungles of Belize, and he explained what he had done, and it's a long story. But so we found out what the tax situation was. We read the records, and then we noticed, we wanted to see what happened when the IRS moved against them. But did anything actually happen? Well, no one seemed to pay more than 4 cents on the dollar, and most of these folks were extremely wealthy, and they would wear down the IRS. I'm not asking anyone to feel sympathetic for the IRS here. Don't get the wrong idea. But the IRS was completely outgunned. I mean, they would have cases going on for 10 full years with, 2, 3 law firms up against some guy in a cubicle, trying to deal with this. And anyway, the fellow in Belize, there was a guy like Javier in Les Miserables who wanted to get this guy in Belize as an IRS guy, investigator, and he had to retire, and he never got him. And this guy in Belize is laughing and laughing. He thinks it's hilarious. He's got 5 cooks, gourmet chefs from all over the world cooking for him. He's got a New York Times and Wall Street Journal flown in every day. He's got cable stuff so he can see stuff. And all the relatives who he can't visit, he flies them to Belize. welcome to the world of tax cheating. But that was startling to me, and what really startled me is that the number of people looking into taxes, first of all, most audits are against wealthy, are about the poor, not the wealthy. They don't actually audit the wealthy that often. That's a problem. But also, the population had gone up 50 or 100 million, and they had the same number of investigators, whatever you want to call it, at the IRS. So this was every year the U.S., this is now years old, almost 10 years old, $200 billion is lost annually to money offshore. And this is a problem for countries all over the world, and it's actually a growing problem. It's a really interesting problem, by the way. And I don't know what the answer is. 60 to 90 offshore jurisdictions like the one I mentioned. So that was interesting because it showed what laws were on the books could be easily avoided. There's tax evasion, we all know that's illegal. There's tax avoidance, which is entirely legal. We all do it every year, try to pay as little as possible on our forms. Then there's tax avoidance. Tax avoidance is that gray area. And of course, that's their favorite area. I think our biggest report in the history of the center, I have to say, and there were 300 reports altogether, and including 14 books, that I was there 15 years, was windfalls of war. We actually, with the invasion of Iraq, we thought it was important to find out, very bluntly stated, who was getting rich from the war. And we were mindful that in no war in previous U.S. history did we ever know that during the war. There was no real-time data ever in any prior war. We saw an opportunity with the internet and the web, and we thought, okay, what could we do here? So we filed 73 Freedom of Information Act requests, and there was this no-bid $7 billion contract from this company called Halliburton. And of course, the vice president, Dick Cheney, had previously been the CEO of that company, and we noticed that it was a no-bid contract. We noticed it was classified, and they weren't releasing it. We went to federal court. We said it's got to be declassified, and we got it. And we posted it on the web along with all the other contracts. And we did all that in the first 6 months. 6 months after the invasion, we had all that up there. And what we saw was the biggest 50 companies, I mean the biggest recipients of our taxpayer money fighting these two wars at that point, they all had two things in common. They had all given lavishly to the political process. That probably is not surprising. And they all had former generals or admirals or other Department of Defense or other U.S. officials on their boards and their top executive suite areas. We identified who they were. We showed all of that. We showed, we had a lot of information about every company. The contractors were apoplectic about this. How dare you? And they wrote that they were God-fearing Americans and that they loved their country, and they didn't think much of us. I can say this was in a Washington Post editorial. So I said to my staff, I think we need to look a little deeper here, and being masochist. And so we decided to look at, I wanted to look more deeply at the Defense Department in general. So we looked at 5 years of all defense contracts, the Pentagon, and it's not for, you have to brace yourself for this. It took 9 months. Actually, I thought it would take longer. And we got lucky. I'll spare you the details unless you want to know later. But essentially what we found was, we essentially found that 40% of all defense contractors have no competitive bidder. Basically they just give it to one company. They don't call it that. They've got a certain nomenclature and a language where it sounds like, well, yes, we have competitive bidding, but of course no one else bids but them, wink, wink. And so the other problem is the subcontractor data that was unavailable. You couldn't, most of them subcontract out, and so then you don't know who the subcontract went to because it's only the first time you see it is the first one who is the lead contractor. So there's all this transparency issue about that. But we thought that was $943 billion in 5 years of defense contracts. Lockheed Martin by far was the biggest in the U.S. all of them, once again, gave lavishly to the political process and had these officials, once again, the same pattern was reinforced, but now we were seeing that there was kind of a cozy system internally. So that was, and the center kept updating that. We did a project with a distinguished co-author in the audience here, and we looked at prosecutors. Prosecutorial misconduct fascinated us. And we noticed that we did a report called Harmful Error, and we wanted to essentially look at times where judges had cited, we didn't want to decide that ourselves, we wanted the court to decide there had been prosecutorial misconduct. So we gathered data, someone in particular here, and magnificently, one of your fellows, and we basically went through 33 years from 1970 to 2003, and we had a team of 12 people altogether, many of them, some of them were lawyers, I guess, and law students as well as journalists, regular journalists, and not so regular, but great journalists. And we were able to show that there had been more than 2,000 cases of prosecutorial misconduct where there was harmful error, and we found there were some prosecutors who had been cited by judges 35 times for harmful error, meaning that they had kept evidence from the other side, and basically the things that you would expect terrible things to happen with one of those. Not a single person was disbarred in the United States for a prosecutor. People don't like disbarring prosecutors generally. I mean, we noticed. And that had never been done. No one ever looked at prosecutors that way. And so that was a report we did. And anyway, you get the idea, on and on and on. One other thing, I want to just talk about the media for a minute or two. We did a report called Well Connected, and I noticed that whenever I was doing book tours and things, people would say, well, how come you never investigate the media? And I was saying, well, yeah, you've got a point there. And so I noticed that on the inheritance tax, a lot of the newspaper chains would do strong editorials about the death tax, and they would never once reveal that it affected them directly, and in fact they were privately lobbying for this. So we were fascinated by it, so we started going deep on it. And we noticed that the Federal Communication Commission, that the commissioners and senior staff had taken 2,500 all-expense-paid trips in an 8-year period. And the #1 destination for these experts on media policy, regulatory policy, was Las Vegas, that mecca for media policy, as you know. And staying in very expensive hotels, lobbyists accompanying them. When you see a trip like that, they're not flying solo, they're closeted with folks. They have limos, the whole 9 yards. Anyway, we wanted to show what it was happening there too, and we did. And so I'm sorry to paint, and we did 2004, the Behind the President, you get the idea here, but I think what I noticed here and what was most disturbing about all this over the years, and I don't have a good way of describing it other than just telling you these stories, is there's sort of a little, I'm sorry to be so tough here, but there's a bit of a charade going on, which the American people have figured out. When you have 40% of state legislative races where there's no one running, just the incumbent doesn't have an opponent. And that's an old stat, it may be worse. And when you have a certain group of people funneling most of the money for the candidates, and you have in elections that are not presidential, something like 60 or 70%, depending on the election and the year, not voting, or perhaps voting with their feet, there is clearly a broken democracy here. I know that that's something that's a familiar topic, and there's some important work that's been done recently by a notable professor here at Harvard. The thing that bothers me is this word corruption. Most people think that means it's illegal. In fact, that's not what it means if you look up the definition. And most of what I've noticed the problem is in Washington is this You could call it systemic corruption, or you could call it, I call it legal corruption, because it's fascinating to me that it's legal. It's completely unbridled. The level of transparency is limited, to put it mildly. Even though I was able to find some of these things out, some of the transparency is still absolutely lacking. And so you know, you can't help but have the feeling that, to be very blunt about it, that it's a bit of a rigged game, that and if you have a lot of money, you get your way. And frankly, that is pretty much what happens. And it's pretty disillusioning, because I really do believe in democracy as a concept. It's just the reality part that I'm having trouble with. So I could go on and on, but I'll stop and we'll do questions. But thank you all very much. I'll stop telling stories. Thank you. Thank you. Yeah, I don't know how this works. You just speak in the mic, or how does this work?
So you push the mic,
Yeah.
and you speak while you're pushing it. I mean, it's...
Yikes, okay. Yeah, maybe,
Thank you so
can you
much.
say your name, if you don't mind, just?
Matthew Mannix. I'm studying economics.
Oh, great.
There's so much stuff I want to say right now, but I think mainly it's just that I just want to say thank you, because it's
thanks.
by awareness that we're going to affect change if we want change. And all this stuff that you speak of is, from an economics point of view, it's completely rational behavior. It shouldn't surprise us in any way,
Right.
especially the fact that most of this stuff is technically legal.
Right.
We shouldn't expect anything different. You know, people are going to act in their own best interest unless the incentive structure is changed, unless they have a pretty serious reason to act differently, to act for the interest of the country. I mean, let's suppose that the United States is the most powerful country in the world. The legislators are some of the most important people in the world, being that they have the power over creating the laws that drive the whole entire country, and it's completely reasonable for us as citizens to expect that they should be acting somewhat ethically.
Right.
And unfortunately, we should not be shocked at all by hearing the stuff that you speak of. And we shouldn't be shocked at all that they do everything they can to try to cover it up. And the laws just have to be adjusted. The framework has to be adjusted.
Right.
Reality is reality. It's not necessarily good or bad. But anyways, thank you
well,
so much.
It's very kind. Thank you. Right here, and then we'll go here and here. Okay, sorry.
So the failure of the gun legislation just yesterday, Gabrielle Giffords wrote an op-ed in the New York Times, and she said that it was due to those who looked at the NRA, the money that they would lose if they voted another way, and thought about their reelection. And then she said that the American people will vote you out of office. That was her model for change. We're going to have to get a new Congress, she said. I'm just quoting her, whatever. And your claim, though, seems to be that that's not going to work. Because if the American public doesn't have the money to fund different candidates, the same candidates, and only those candidates funded, let's say, by the NRA, are going to run. So I want to know whether you think that there is some solution in what she's proposing. In other words, this question is, how are you going to get a different Congress, okay, if you don't have the money to fund different candidates? And so does the issue come down to something that a previous speaker in his series this year spoke about, namely alternative ways of financing candidates so that 40% of the elections don't go uncontested?
Right.
And I'm just quoting from the Gabrielle Giffords thing, because you've made it seem like her proposal is essentially hopeless.
Well, I love that editorial. And she noted $25 million was spent, not just altogether, with lobbying, contributions, and other things by the NRA just in the last 2 years. I thought it was very eloquent. editorial. My concern is that, I don't have the latest statistics. There's probably people in the audience that do. The average cost of a U.S. Senate seat, the average cost of a House seat. Most mere mortals don't have 1 or 2 million laying around, and they don't have a year or two to run for office. I used to say that there's a reason Frank Capra didn't make a sequel to Mr. Smith Goes to Washington, because it becomes a Stephen King movie. By the time they enter the city limits, they have already made arrangements and deals to get money from certain folks, and they're already obligated to some point. Now, I know that we think that's the American way. It's all about a plurality of interests, and it's a representative body, and folks come from different places and different interests. I get all that. The problem is the cost of campaigning. And what I was starting to say about the media, and I've sort of went off somewhere else, is that the media corporations don't cover politics anymore. The largest single source of news in America is local TV. And they cover, as we all know, the latest car wreck, murder, sports, and weather, especially weather. Just kidding. And they do not cover politics. Why is that? Because now they make money from political ads. It used to be 80 million in 2000. Now it's $1 billion in a cycle. Is one of the leading sources of income for the broadcast industry. When I interviewed former President Jimmy Carter for the last Buying of the President book, he said that the U.S. is the only advanced society or developed country in the world, democracy, that does not have free airtime for politicians. When I interviewed McCain and Feingold separately, they both said the same exact thing. The most powerful interest in the United States today is actually the media industry, the broadcaster, because not only do they give millions of dollars like everyone else, they control whether your face and your voice gets airtime, and that's power, big time. And so so the media is actually part of the problem. It's also why we have continual campaigns, because if they're not running for office and buying ads, they're screaming at each other in the off months on cable with split screens. And so this continual, we're having a nonstop campaign. It's mostly because it's an information age now. I talked to Leon Panetta years ago after he had just been chief of staff to the president. And he said once we had 24-hour cable in the early 80s, the currency was going on TV within minutes and framing the public discourse in a matter of seconds or minutes, and no one really cared about what was done in committee. They wanted to be saying certain things to the American people. So we have a really fundamentally broken system here, and it needs to be fixed in a lot of different ways. So I'm not saying I have stayed away from becoming an overt reformer. My job is to shine a light and expose, and if I start doing the other, it looks like it's a brief for some cause. Do I think the system's broken? Absolutely. And do I think there's ways to fix it? Absolutely. But what I'm saying about Giffords, and to your point, it's not enough to throw the bums out in the next election. It's actually a more endemic problem, and the issue is not throwing out the current group. It's also solving these larger problems that, frankly, are extremely difficult problems, especially with the U.S. Supreme Court. Don't get me started, and I'm sure you've heard a few things about the U.S. Supreme Court from Professor Lessig and others. So all I'm trying to say is, I'm not trying to say it's hopeless, but we should also be realistic. It didn't happen overnight, and it's not going to be solved overnight. And we haven't had a reformer or populist presidential candidate who actually was serious about doing anything about what we're talking about here. I don't think, not in the last 40 years in this country. And the problem is they get isolated, and they also don't have money for ads anyway, whoever they are. So we have a problem here, and I don't have all the answers. I'm just telling you, you're making a great point. I'm saying I've just seen so many angles that these people have played, not the least of which is the Federal Election Commission, which has, did I mention, 6 commissioners, and every time they want to issue a subpoena, gosh darn it, it's a 3-3 vote. Those Republicans and Democrats, they always match each other, and there's not another person, another commissioner. They can't ever break the tie, so there's no investigations of the fraud involving the campaigns. And did they set that up? Of course they did. So that's what I'm getting at. This stuff drives me nuts because I see what's not happening, and I know it's not coincidental. That's really what you're hearing. I should be taken. Yeah, here.
Just a couple of asides. It's interesting to me that that editorial that was mentioned by Giffords didn't run a week ago before the vote. It doesn't really make a lot of difference after the vote. I'm not really all that interested, sort of, in a way. And I would differ with you about the reform candidate. You know, he may not be the perfect politician, but I think Ralph Nader really did epitomize a lot of what you're talking about, and did an admirable job under extremely difficult circumstances. Just so that's my view on that. I am interested in who are the key people bankrolling Obama, in the light of your analyses, and you sort of update it to who are the key people bankrolling Obama. And secondly, you mentioned ethanol, and that's of really, really immediate, keen interest to me, because a big oil company now want to run ethanol by train through Cambridge, just up here in Porter Square on the commuter rail line, because it's going to be cheaper for them than shipping it by barge. And so I'd be interested in if you could say a little bit more about the ethanol, the way that ethanol lobbying worked with Archer Daniels Midland and Bob Dole, and what years were the crucial years for that. And interestingly, one of the people who is maybe, you know, seems to be the lead opponent of this, actually got 3 checks for the legal maximum in the state of Massachusetts. He got 3 checks for $500 each from 3 different members of the Slivka family, Eric Slivka being the CEO of Global Partners LP, the top Fortune 500 oil company that wants to ship ethanol now by train rather than by barge.
Wow. I hear you. There's a lot to respond to. Let me just say, you know, for example, regarding Ralph Nader. First of all, I'm nonpartisan, and I don't get involved with all these people. Do I know many of the candidates, and have I met them and interviewed them? The answer is yes, and I've known Nader for many years, and I'll leave that there. But I'm not. There's an issue that he raises, or that is raised by mentioning him, is the debates. You may recall that Ross Perot and Nader were both excluded from the debates. Study the history.
It was Buchanan, Pat Buchanan. Well, all right. Okay.
Right. Well, no, Perot was shut out in '96 also, and then all I'm getting at is the debates are essentially, substantially controlled by the 2 political parties. And it's in their interest, and it's particularly in one party's interest, especially after 1992, for there to not be third-party candidates in the general election debates. And we've never really seen it since, if you think about it. That's another subject. Obama, I have not, you know, we have investigated his administration, and it's a long story, but I have not done a career patron analysis lately, or ever actually, because I left the center before we did that. You can be sure that the most powerful interests in America are well represented with the Obama administration. I gather that he's very close also to Silicon Valley in general, but there are many, many interests. Whenever money and power go together, and always, and the reason they want advisors close to the next president, and the reason they want to give money is they all want access, of course. And so I don't think you have to worry too much about, I know that you're not worried, but that Obama doesn't have a lot of money. He raised twice what George W. Bush did. This is a guy who'd only been a state legislator 4 years earlier. In '08, he doubled the number George W., a sitting president, raised. Think about this. $375 million for Bush. Obama comes in at $750 million. And then the number, as you know, hit $1 billion with this recent election. So we always say that, but it gets really old, that whoever is president, it's the most expensive election in history until the next election. And that's where we are. Ethanol, I'm not a complete expert in the whole history of ethanol. There are histories of that, and when it started, and how and of course now it's affecting the whole food subject globally. I realize it has actually become even more interesting in some ways because of the latest problems with food around the world. But I should defer on that, because it's not, that's a long conversation by itself, so I'll stop. But check it out, because I'm sure it's very interesting. And that subsidy is interesting, too.
Do you have a reference, maybe, for that?
Not off the top of my head, sorry. I know that they exist, though. Sorry, who was next here? You got, sorry, yeah.
I'm Michael Morrissey. I've talked to a lot of newsrooms. You're talking about the importance of freedom of information and requesting your reporting. Most newsrooms I talked to said they file a handful, if any, FOIA requests a year now. What's the cost of that? Has that changed from what it used to be? And is there any sort of replacement in terms of getting people to ask for an annual public transparency?
It's a great question. Associated Press did a study of the Obama administration and found that Obama responds to freedom of information requests more slowly than George W. Bush. What Obama does that's interesting is big data. So he'll release information about 2 million visitors to the White House, which has a titillation factor, but they're actually going slow or as slow or slower than other presidents with the actual requests. The biggest request for freedom of information, not just in the U.S. but around the world, I should note that 90 countries out of 193 have some form of transparency laws. We are not the first country, by the way, to enact that law in 1966. The first laws were in the 1700s in Scandinavia. But the bottom line is that this is the biggest thing that fascinates me is that companies are finding out about their competitors. It's company requests about other companies that are the top requests for freedom of information. As you know, certain agencies, you'll never get the information. See the CIA and other national security agencies that are woefully inadequate about responding. I mean, it's dreadful. It's just plain, they don't bother almost. Part of the problem is news organizations, as you are probably aware, have 1/3 fewer newspaper reporters in America than 20 years ago, and the news organizations themselves are less willing to go to court and to go aggressively on an appeal. So we have those kinds of issues with freedom of information in general. I think all journalists, I have to tell you something, I have never lost an appeal. I've only appealed a few times, but every time we win. So I'm like, wow, we got to keep doing this. Pardon? Starts as an appeal, and if they don't cough it up, it'll be a lawsuit. I don't do a lot of those, but the few that we've done actually worked. And so what I'm noticing is that if there's heat, there will be a response. I mean, the Center for Public Integrity just looked at 700 million Medicare records. The initial response of the Department of Health and Human Services was, we can't give it to you. They didn't want to find out about each little case. They wanted the patterns to be revealed. So they actually filed, the same fellow, Peter Smith, on the staff that filed the lawsuit getting the Halliburton contract is still at the center. He filed a thing, and it was in the court for all of like a week or less. And the Department of HHS said, can we talk to you? And they basically coughed up the data. So they didn't want to go anywhere near a lawsuit because they knew damn well they had no standing. They were just trying to scare the center, and the center, to its credit, called their bluff. And so that's, a lot of reporters don't have the time or take the time, where their news organizations don't back them. That's an issue. It's a problem. I mean, there needs to be a lot more aggressiveness, bottom line. That's one of the things. It's not the only. And the FOIA laws, of course, have to get better in general. I think, is it you and then behind? 1, 2, okay, sorry.
Yes, I noticed you kind of took a swipe at the Supreme Court, and I assume it's about the Citizens United case, which the ACLU and the Reporters Committee for Freedom of the Press both sided with the case of Citizens United, on the side of Citizens United, because they wanted to distribute a movie about Hillary Clinton, but they were told it was against the law to distribute a movie at that time, which seems to me a gross violation of the First Amendment. I guess, you know, why do you impugn the Supreme Court? I mean, if you don't agree with the decision, that's one thing, but it seems like that decision has become the bête noire of particularly people on the left.
Look, I'm not a legal scholar and I'm not a lawyer, so I'll just give you my impression. The Buckley case in '76 and the Citizens United case in 2010, both of them have opened up the floodgates to private wealth and also last-minute shenanigans with massive amounts of money coming into campaigns. I'm a real practical guy. I'm noticing this. Those decisions are directly related, and my favorite story about this is John Paul Stevens, the Supreme Court Justice who wrote the dissenting opinion, who I might add is a Republican, who was appointed by Gerald Ford. And the Federal Election Campaign Act amendment of 1974 that created the Federal Election Commission and did all these other post-Watergate things, Ford said the times demand this legislation. And then he appointed Stevens in '75. And read Stevens' opinion about Citizens United. He thought, and still, it's an abomination. And I'm not a legal scholar. It sure looks like an abomination to me. I still have a problem about corporations being people too, and I also have a problem with them doing unlimited things, because I can tell you who has the most money, and it's not people, individual people. And so I think it has affected the way campaigns are waged. I think it further ensures that you have to be extremely wealthy. Let me give you a statistic. Hold on to your seat. We did the buying of the Congress in 1987. In 1997, we checked the financial disclosure records for every member of the United States Senate. The net worth of them, 36 of them were millionaires out of 100. Fast forward to today, in the last year or two, we checked it again through an organization that does that annually or periodically. It's now 70 members of the U.S. Senate out of 100. And less than 1% of Americans are millionaires. So that's what we're doing to politics. We're actually running out ordinary folks. Forget Harry Truman, Abraham Lincoln, and Jimmy Stewart, okay? They're not running. They can't. Yeah. Sure.
The New York Times is a corporation.
Right.
They have a right to distribute and publish material that will affect elections. How can you deny other groups of Americans that same right? I'm not talking about the entire election system. I'm talking about something narrow that seems to violate grossly the First Amendment of the United States.
I understand. I happen to think that they have plenty of time and rights to say what they want, and believe me, they seem to do it all the time with their ads throughout the year, and they also do it on websites. And so my handkerchief is not coming out for them. And I don't care who the group is, that's different than an individual, and it does affect politics. I haven't investigated this deeply, but do I think there's something peculiar about it? I do, and I'm not alone. And if you look at the dark money coming into campaigns since 2010, it was 45% of the money. We didn't know where it came from. Call me crazy, but I have a problem with that. There's no more disclosure, transparency, because partly of this kind of shenanigans. Back here, yeah. Oh, yeah.
You mentioned that you've never lost an appeal or had to go to an appeal for the Freedom of Information Act, but there's a money story there as well. That is the cost of using the legal system. And I just think that's another interesting story. We have this image of the law and equality before the law, but the cost for most papers of getting one bit of information for a story is probably going to be prohibitive unless they're trying to make their name on that one story, and I don't think others. So I think there's a great story on journalism, production costs, and revenue they might get from it, selling papers. I don't know if you have any thoughts on that.
Yeah, I do. It's a great point. No, newspapers are reluctant, and I've got a book coming out whenever it comes out. I've been on it for about 8 years. People think it's never coming out, but it is. And I've talked to people who are reporters and lawyers who run things like reporters committees, and they say that the question is, would the press today stand up to power the way the New York Times and Washington Post did in 1971? And people aren't really sure, to your point. They're not sure the newspapers would spend the money on it. They don't know the bloggers or these websites, are they willing to spend large sums of money in following cases, but also appealing them sometimes for months and risking extinction should they lose, by the way. And you now have James Goodale, the New York Times attorney who defended and took the New York Times all the way to the Supreme Court and won that case, now saying that President Obama is the worst president of the United States since Nixon about going after leakers and not supporting journalists. And I know a number of journalists who have been subpoenaed and are under scrutiny, and also are hiring lawyers to defend their job and their life, basically. So this is a very serious problem. We know that freelancers are unusually vulnerable to what you're asking. If you're a freelancer, who's going to defend you? Good luck. And so it's a real problem. That is an issue. I don't know what the answer is with that either, of course. Sorry, it's easy for me to just say this. I don't have to answer it. Back here and then up here. Yeah. Yeah, sorry. And then I'll come
Jed Schwartz.
Okay.
There's a general difference of opinion, I think, between Larry, this is my take on Larry Lessig and Robert Reich. The general position is we should eliminate corporate welfare because it's un-American and undemocratic. There's an alternative position, which is corporate welfare is inevitable, and the only cure for its abuse is daylight and transparency. That tends to be my that tends to be the position I lean toward. I'm wondering how. First of all, I think I got Larry Lessig's position right, but clearly, that. But I'm wondering what you think about that.
That's a long conversation. I think that the funny part is most corporations don't want to call it that, and most of them don't want to acknowledge what you just said. And I think it's a complex question. There may be situations where that's merited, just like there is other welfare that is sometimes merited. That's not my. I basically investigate the bastards. That's pretty much what I do, and so I haven't had to lay awake at night and answer that question, but I'm generally not usually in favor of corporate welfare. Call me crazy. I think you're the last question here, sorry.
So thank you, this is very rich in the examples you gave.
Sure, thanks.
Great variety. My simple question is, how do you or people you work with decide which cases to investigate? And so to make it more specific, with all these cases that you said share in common is the fact that they're on the one hand legal, and then on the other hand they smell fishy. But then from one, right. But then there are great variations. Those that we would think are now legal, but should become illegal, right? That we should legislate against them. Then there's those that are legal and should remain legal, but they're unethical or they require a certain kind of regulation, but not be prohibited. And then there's those like Forbes and the flat tax, which seems, I mean, people could just argue about this, but seems kind of benign in the sense that. So you don't want him to pass that law because it'll affect him personally. So that's right. The question. And related, in my mind related, but you can answer this separately, is Professor Lessig mentioned that this is an academic university-based sort of organization. So how does that influence the kind of investigation that you do, and whether you could would do them otherwise than you would do if it would be outside of the academia? Outside of the university or the...
Yeah, because I'm at a university now, and we do investigations. There's no difference except I have more students to work with. I'm just kidding. And we have infrastructure that we ordinarily wouldn't have. That's a long story. There are 78 nonprofits in the U.S. 18 of them are university-based centers, some are C3 standalones and some are within, but there are issues that get raised by how do you do those investigations and what happens if you're threatened with a lawsuit, which we have been. So far, knock on wood, it's not a problem. But to your question about how you decide, I mean, with the Forbes thing, I noticed the press wasn't going there, and it was a playful thing on our part. I admit it, but what the hell? And it was interesting too. And so, so part of this is to kind of do things we know that we think should be done. And usually, this was me, that should be done that aren't being done or pointed out, just because no one's doing it and it's slightly irritating. Sometimes it's not done. This is not like Public Citizen in 1970 doing really spectacular, epic, densely written in a good way with footnotes and you carefully research things as a brief for therefore you should have this law. We don't have that at the end. Our job is we're basically muckrakers. That's what we do, but we do it systematically, and we do footnotes too. And we use documents mostly. We use more documents, I suspect, than most people. 700 million in the case of Medicare, which is the all-time record, I think, for journalism so far for the number. It really comes down to issues that seem fresh and seem like they haven't been looked at closely, and where it might be constructive. And then you have an obligation to occasionally revisit things too. I mean, that's why we did 3 buying of the presidents, because it kept getting interesting, because we also had new candidates, which meant there were new issues. So our work certainly never ends, I think it's fair to say, for all journalists, not just us. So anyway, thank you all very much. It was fabulous. Thank you.